Okay, so getting ready to put the motor together for the square body. This is a Gen 6 454 that I just got back from the machine shop. We had it board 60 over, so it'll be a 468. So when assembling a block, cleanliness is the most important thing. So there's a lot of cleaning involved. So here I'm cleaning out all the main journals in the block, spraying them full of carb cleaner, blowing them out with air. And then here I'm taking a clean cloth and just cleaning all the dirt, any oil, any residue out from inside the journals where the bearings are going to sit. And next we have brand new bearings, but even right out of the box, those need to be cleaned too, both backside and front side. So we're just taking carb cleaner on a cloth, clean the back sides, and then clean the front sides. And now we can put the bearings in the freshly cleaned block. So we just carefully set them in. There's a tang or a little notch on one side, but not the other. So these only go in one way. So you just line them up, and they're kind of a tough press fit. You gotta press them down in there until they kind of snap in place. So now we're gonna open up the brand new crank, and even though it's brand new, it's still full of dirt and oil everywhere. So here I'm cleaning the main journals that I'm about to set into those bearings, and also just kind of wiping off the rest of the crank too while I'm at it. Not going too crazy with the rod journals because I want to clean those separately when I install the rods. So right now it's just mainly trying to get those main journals super clean as I can possibly get them. And we're blowing out the oil passages with air too. Okay, so here we're going to carefully set the crank in dry with no lubricant, because to check the bearing tolerances you don't want to have any oil or lubrication or anything in there. Just want to set the crank in dry, and then we'll test all the bearing clearances, and then we'll reinstall it later. And here's an example of some junk and crud that's still left inside, so you really have to check every single little passage, every hole, and just make sure you clean all the junk out of everywhere. Cleanliness is key to make an engine live. So here we install the top half of the main bearing cap, bearings into the caps. And once again, clean them with carb cleaner. This is the plastigauge material. This is what we're going to use to check the bearing clearances. It's real fine and easy to lose, so I try to pick it up with the tweezers. And we just place one small piece of this on each one of the bearing journals that we're going to measure. So then we can carefully place each of the bearing caps on, again with no assembly lube because that would mess up our measuring material, obviously. So one thing that you have to be careful about is what sort of lubricant you put on your bolts in order to torque them down. There's different ways to do this. You can use the 30 weight engine oil, it's pretty common, or you can use something like ARP's assembly lube, but depending on which type of lubricant you use on the threads of your bolts, it'll drastically change the torque setting that you end up with. So for this application, I'm using 30 weight engine oil, and the torque spec for that is 110 foot-pounds on each of these bolts. Then I'm going to torque the mains down to the full torque spec of 110 foot-pounds, but in 3 passes. So you go in kind of a crisscross pattern, and the first pass I think is 45 foot-pounds, the second pass is 75 or 80, and then the final pass will be 110. And after they're torqued, we loosen them all back up and take the caps back off. Now we can take our little plastigauge chart and try to kind of match it up to the thickness of the lines that we got on the bearing journals. This doesn't have to be exact. It's just the plastigauge is meant to get you close. If you really want to be exact, you'd use a micrometer and measure all these down to the 100,000th. All these on this particular motor are supposed to be about 2.5 thousandths, 2 to 2.5 thousandths, except for the very back one, this wide one in the back, the rear main, that one should be about 3 thousandths. But you can kind of tell just by looking at these, they're all, between 2 and 3 thousandths, so we're good. And I have to make sure to remind myself before you assemble the engine, make sure to remove all that plastigauge, otherwise you're going to have a bad day. So we're using carb cleaner and we're wiping all that stuff back off again. And then we can take the crank back out. This motor has a rear main seal. Looks like this. It's a one-piece seal. It goes on the end of the crank and sits right in the back of the block here. And there's a groove down in here that's got a little bit of a shoulder on it right here, that edge. And so when this seal goes in, if you were tapping it in from the outside, you'd want to tap, 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 tap until it hits right there, right on the edge of that little shoulder on the inside. If you didn't tap it quite far enough, or if you tapped it flush with the block, it actually wouldn't be in all the way. So I want to measure, just in case I ever have to replace this seal in the future, I want to know how far in do I need to tap that thing without going too far and crushing it. I need to know exactly how deep that is. Just a caliper here, zero it out, and I want to measure exactly where that little shoulder is. Looks like about right there, 610 thousandths. Yeah, just about 610 thousandths. So when this goes in, how thick is this? .392. I think 500 thousandths would be a ½ inch. That's less than that. 392. That's what I. So I read on this particular engine, these Gen 6 454s, this rear main bearing where the cap meets the block needs just a tiny little paper thin coating of sealant, of like an anaerobic sealant of some kind. A lot of people use black RTV, so that's what I'm using here. Otherwise you'll have an oil leak there. And this rear main cap also has a little O-ring that gets sandwiched between it and the block too, so I gotta not forget to install that. And then this is just a regular engine assembly lube. The rear main bearing has both the face of the bearing, but then it also has a front and back. Those are the thrust surfaces that control the front to back movement of the crank. So we put a little lube on that too. So now this time when we're installing all these main caps, now we can lube them up good and install them for the final time. First time we installed them dry so we could do the plastigauge. Now this time we're installing them all with the lube. And then I'll go back over these and torque them all down in the same sequence that I showed before earlier. Okay, so right now I need to measure the thrust clearance on the crank. It's all installed, mains are all torqued down, everything's good, and I got the crank forced as far as it will go forward. So I have this little dial indicator on here set to 0. And since the crank is all the way forward, now I need to put a screwdriver in there and push it backwards and see how far it moves. And they say, I think this motor is supposed to be somewhere between like 5 and 8 thousandths or something like that. And I'll have to look it up, but I think that's pretty close. So I need to see how much forward-backward movement the crank has. So this is on 0, and I got this little black mark on 8. So I'm just gonna put the screwdriver in there, force the crank backwards, see what we get. Gotta find a spot where I can get good leverage on it. How much is that? Moved it back forward, so we're at 0. Now I'm gonna move it backwards again. Well, that's not hitting 8, but it's maybe 5 or 6. Yep, so I think it's within tolerance anyway. If it were any wider or tighter than that, we'd have a problem, but I think that's just fine the way it is. So to wrap up the video, this is a little progress update on the truck itself. We've got the cab and the firewall painted. This is some ultra blue pearl that are mixed in. So I did a white base and then a couple coats of the blue pearl. And now that the firewall's done, it's ready for the engine to go in. So that's why we're in the process of building the motor now. That's it for now. Stay tuned.